The popular fallacy which likens circumstantial evidence to a chain naturally found no acceptance in the mind of Superintendent Merrington. If a link in a chain snaps, the captive springs free, but if he is bound by a rope, it is necessary for all the strands to be severed before liberty can be regained. Merrington remained at Herodotus to weave additional strands for the rope of circumstantial evidence by which Hazel Rath was held for the murder of Violet Herodotus. It was a good strong case as it stood, but Merrington had seen too many strong ropes nibbled through by sharp legal teeth to leave anything to chance. If the circumstances against Hazel Rath remained open to an alternative explanation, if, for example, the defense suggested that the mother was implicated in the crime and the daughter was silent in order to shield her, it might be difficult to obtain a conviction. Merrington knew by wide experience how alternative theories weakened the case of circumstantial evidence, no matter how strong the presumption from the known facts appeared to be. A useful strand in circumstantial evidence is motive, and it was motive that Merrington sought to prove against Hazel Rath. His own inference about the crime, swiftly and boldly reached shortly before he arrested her, was that the girl was in love with Phil Herodotus, and had murdered his young wife through jealousy. Hazel's silence in the face of accusation supported that theory, in his opinion. She was ashamed to confess, not the crime, but the hopeless love which had inspired it. Women were like that, Merrington reflected. A woman who dared to commit murder would blush to admit, even to herself, that she had given her love to a man who was out of her reach. But it is one thing to hold a theory, and another thing to prove it in the eyes of the law. As Hazel Rath was not likely to help the Crown establish motive by confessing her love for Philip Herodotus, it was left to Superintendent Merrington to establish his theory, by all the independent facts and inferences he was able to bring to light. This proved more difficult than he anticipated. He had visualized the situation with excellent insight up to a certain point, and he had imagined that it would not be a difficult matter to obtain proofs of the existence of an early flirtation or intrigue between Phil Herodotus and the pretty girl who had occupied an anomalous position in the moat house. But a further examination of the inmates of the household failed to furnish any proofs in support of that supposition. Merrington could readily understand Miss Herodotus and her brother denying such a suggestion, but the fact that none of the servants had seen anything of the kind was fairly convincing proof that no such relation existed. No class have a keener instinct for scandal than the servants of a country house. They have opportunities of seeing hidden things which nobody else is likely to suspect. And the moat house servants asserted, with complete unanimity, that there had been nothing between Phil Herodotus and Hazel Rath during the time the girl had lived at the moat house. Their relations had been friendly, but nothing more. There was no record of secret looks, stolen kisses, or surprise meetings to support the theory of a mutual flirtation or furtive love. It was impossible to doubt that Phil Herodotus' attitude to the girl who had occupied a dependent position in his home had been actuated by no warmer feeling than a sort of brotherly regard. Merrington, versed by long experience in forming an estimate of character from second-hand opinion, was forced to the conclusion that Phil Herodotus was not the type of young man to betray the innocence or trifle with the feelings of a young and unsophisticated girl. The servant's testimony revealed him as gentle and courteous, but shy and reserved, not fond of company, and immersed in his natural history pursuits. Merrington, however, had less difficulty in proving to his own satisfaction that Hazel Rath had been secretly in love with Phil Herodotus almost since the days of her childhood. There was, to begin with, the greenstone brooch which Caldew had picked up in the bedroom after Mrs. Herodotus had been murdered. The members of the household were in the custom of making the girl little presents on her birthday anniversary, and Phil had given her the piece of greenstone, set in a brooch, on her birthday 6 years before. There was no secret about it. The gift had been chosen on the suggestion of Miss Herodotus, who told Merrington the facts. What was unknown was the addition of the inscription, Semper Fidelis, which must have been scratched on the brooch subsequently by the girl herself as a girlish vow of love and fidelity of the giver. Detective Caldew might have ascertained these facts and shortened the police investigations by the simple process of asking Miss Herodotus about the brooch in the first instance. But it is easy to be wise after the event, and Superintendent Merrington was the last man to quarrel with his subordinate for excess of caution in the initial stage of the investigations, when it was his duty to doubt everybody and confide in nobody. Moreover, Merrington could not forget that he himself had completely underestimated the importance of that clue when Caldew had drawn his attention to it. A search of Hazel's bedroom at Stating brought to light additional testimony of the love which was likely to destroy her. Merrington and Caldew, ruthlessly turning over the feminine appointments of this dainty little nest, had unearthed from the bottom of the girl's box a square parcel tied with ribbon. The packet contained letters and postcards from Phil, principally picture postcards from different continental places he had visited after leaving Cambridge. There were 3 letters, 2 schoolboy epistles, asking the girl to look after the pets he had left at home, and 1 short note from the university announcing the dispatch of a volume of poems as a birthday gift. There was also a Christmas card, dated some years before, inscribed, "To Dear Phil, with love, from Hazel." The girl had kept it, perhaps, because she was too shy to bestow it on the intended recipient, but its chief value in Merrington's eyes was the similarity between the written capital F and the same letter in the scratched inscription on the greenstone brooch. With these discoveries Merrington was satisfied. In Hazel Rath's secret love for Phil Herodotus, the Crown was supplied with the motive for the murder of Phil Herodotus's wife. In Merrington's opinion, the supposition of motive was strengthened by the fact that the murder was committed during Hazel's first visit to the moat house since the arrival of the young bride, because until Phil's marriage it had been the girl's custom to visit the moat house once a week. Miss Herodotus informed Merrington that she had questioned the girl on the afternoon of the murder about the sudden cessation of her visits, and Hazel had replied rather evasively. Merrington formed the opinion that she had stayed away because she could not bear to see the woman whom Phil had made his wife. Then, realizing that her prolonged absence was likely to be remarked upon, she went across on the day of the murder to see her mother. Merrington did not think that the murder was premeditated. His belief was that when the girl found herself back in the surroundings where she had spent such a happy girlhood in association with Phil Herodotus, she was seized with a mad fit of jealousy against her successful rival, and under its influence had rushed upstairs and murdered her. Merrington had also come to the conclusion that her mother knew nothing about the crime until afterwards, and then she had endeavored to shield her daughter by lying to the police and sending Millie Saker out of the way. Merrington was unable to account for Hazel's possession of the revolver with which Mrs. Herodotus had been killed. The girl maintained her stubborn silence after her arrest, and refused to answer any questions about the weapon or anything connected with the crime. The police assumption was that she had obtained the revolver from the gun room of the moat house shortly before the murder was committed. The gun room was underground. It had originally been the crypt of the Saxon castle which had once stood on the site where the moat house was built, and was entered by a short flight of steps not far from the passage which led to the housekeeper's rooms. It was rectangular in shape, and, like the majority of gun rooms in old English country mansions, contained a large assortment of ancient and modern weapons. Neither Sir Philip Herodotus nor Miss Herodotus was able to state whether the revolver found in the housekeeper's room belonged to the moat house or was the property of one of the guests, and Phil Herodotus was too ill to be asked. As expert evidence at the inquest definitely determined that the bullet extracted from the murdered woman had been fired from the revolver, Merrington did not attach very much importance to the question of ownership, but before his departure for London he arranged that Caldew should return to the moat house later with the revolver for Phil's inspection, in the hope of settling the point before the trial. Miss Herodotus had undertaken to let the detectives know when her nephew was well enough to be seen, but as time went on she doubted whether he would ever recover. Although the delirium which had followed his seizure had passed away, he was slow in regaining health, and remained in bed, listless and indifferent to everything, sometimes reading a little, but oftener lying still, staring at the wall. He was passive and quiet, and obedient as a child. He seemed to have no recollection of the events of the night of the murder, and his aunt did not dare to recall them to his mind. It was for Phil's sake, and for him only, that she was able to preserve her own courage and calmness through the sordid ordeal of the lengthy inquest and the empty pomp of the funeral of the young wife. Her own heart was bruised and numb within her with the horrors which had been heaped upon her. She was like one who had seen a pit open suddenly at her feet, revealing terrible human obscenities and abominations wallowing nakedly in the depths. It was a poignant shock to her that human nature was capable of such infamy. Her startled virgin eyes saw for the first time in the monstrous passion of sex a force which was stronger than her own most cherished beliefs. If a sweet and gentle girl like Hazel Rath, who had been brought up under her own eye to walk uprightly, could be swept away in the surge of tempestuous passion to commit murder, where did faith and religion stand? Almost as much as the effect of the murder did she fear the result of this second revelation on her nephew. The knowledge that the person accused of killing his wife was a girl who had lived in his own home for years was bound to have an additionally injurious effect on his strange and sensitive temperament. Nobody knew that temperament better than Miss Herodotus. It was not the Herodotus temperament. It had been the heritage of his mother, a strange, elfin, wayward creature, who had died bringing Phil into the world. Like all sisters, Miss Herodotus had wondered what her brother had seen in his wife to marry her. Phil had all along been a disappointment to his father. He had come into the world with a lame foot and a frail frame, and the Herodotus had always been noted for masculine strength and grace. Instead of growing up with a scorn for books and an absorbing love of sport, like a true Herodotus, Phil had early revealed symptoms of a bookish, studious disposition, reserved and shy, with little liking for other boys or boyish games. His one hobby was an interest in natural history. He devoted his pocket money to the purchase of strange pets, which he kept in cages while they lived and stuffed when they died. Miss Herodotus had disapproved of this hobby, but had suffered it in silence, on the principle that a Herodotus could do no wrong, until one winter's morning she had been frightened into her first and only fit of hysterics by discovering a large spotted snake coiled snugly on some flannel garments she was making for the wife of the curate, in anticipation of that unfortunate lady's fifth lying in. Investigation brought to light the fact that the snake had been surreptitiously purchased by Master Phil from a Covent Garden dealer. He had kept it in a box in the stables, but, finding it torpid with cold one night, he had put it in his aunt's workbasket for the sake of the warmth. When Miss Herodotus recovered from her hysterics, she had seen to it that Phil was packed off to school almost as quickly as the snake was packed off to the zoological gardens. After Phil's college days, his father's influence had obtained for him a government post which was to be the forerunner of a diplomatic career, if Phil cared for it. That was before the war, which upset so many plans. In his capacity of assistant departmental secretary, Phil had nothing particular to do, and an ample allowance from his father to spend in his leisure time. Many young men in these circumstances, thrown on their own resources in London with plenty of money to spend, would have lost no time in going wrong, but Phil's temperament preserved him from those temptations which so many young well-born men find irresistible. He had a disdain for the stage, he did not care for chorus girls, he disliked horse racing, and he did not drink. He sought distractions in another way, and rumors of those distractions filtered in due course down to his family home in Sussex. It was whispered that Phil was queer, that his old passion for petting reptiles and lower animal forms had merely been diverted into another channel. He had become a socialist, and had been seen consorting with the lower orders at East End meetings with other people sufficiently respectable to have known better. It was even stated that he had supported an Irish revolutionary countess, who had discovered the first socialist in Jesus Christ, and wanted to disestablish the Church of England, by taking the chair for her when she announced these tenets to the rabble in Hyde Park one fine Sunday afternoon. A Herodotus, a socialist and nonconformist. These were bitter blows to Miss Herodotus, a woman soaked in family and church tradition, but she bore the shock with uncompromising front, and was able to make the shortcomings of Phil's mother a vicarious sacrifice for the misdeeds of the son. But the bitterest blow to Miss Herodotus's family pride was the news of Phil's marriage. Till then she had pinned her faith, like a wise woman, in the reformative influence of a good marriage. Although a spinster herself, she was aware that there was no better method of reducing the showy nettlesome paces of youth to the sober jog-trot of middle age than the restraining influence of the right kind of yokefellow. The qualities Phil most needed in a wife were those possessed by a sober-minded, unimaginative, placid girl of conventional mold. Such maidens are not unknown in rural England, and Miss Herodotus had not much difficulty in picking upon one in the county sufficiently well-born to mate with the Herodotus. Miss Herodotus perfected her plan in detail, and had even gone to the length of drafting the letter which was to bring Phil down from London to be matrimonially snared, when the news came that he had snared himself in London without his aunt's assistance. She did not like his wife from the first, and it was equally certain that Phil's wife did not like her. It was a marvelous thing to Miss Herodotus that a shallow worldly girl like Violet should have captured the heart of a young man like her nephew so completely as to cause him to alter his ways of life for her. Phil loved nature, and books, and solitary ways. His wife detested such things. Phil, in his eagerness to please her, and banish her apparent boredom with country life, had suggested asking some people from London with whom, at one time, he would have had very little in common. Perhaps his London life had changed him, but if so, it was a change for the worse for a young man, and a Herodotus, to be so much under the thumb of his wife as to give up his own habits of life at her behest. But Phil was so much in love that he had done so, cheerfully and willingly. Violet's lightest wish was his law. These thoughts, and others like them, passed and repassed through Miss Herodotus's mind as she sat, day after day, in her nephew's sick room. It was her custom to take her needlework there of an afternoon, and relieve the nurse for 2 or 3 hours. But her sewing frequently lay idle in her lap, and she leaned back in her chair, absorbed in thought, glancing from time to time at Phil's worn face on the pillow, where he lay like one exhausted and weary, reluctant to return to the turmoil of life. He took his food and medicine with the docility of a child, and occasionally smiled at his aunt when she ministered to him. Gradually he mended and increased in bodily strength until he was able to sit up, and smoke an occasional cigarette. Sometimes he talked a little with his aunt, but always on indifferent subjects. He never asked about his wife, or spoke of the murder, as he had done in his delirium. It was apparent to those about him that his recollection of the events which had brought about his illness had not yet returned. Nature had, for the time being, soothed his stricken brain with temporary oblivion. Then one day the change that Miss Herodotus anticipated and feared came on him as swiftly as a dream. She entered the room to find him up and dressed, walking up and down with a quick and hurried stride. One glance from his quick dark eyes conveyed to her that his wandering senses had recrossed the borderline of consciousness, and entered into the horror and agony of remembrance. "Phil, dear," she said, hastening to his side, "is this wise?" "How long have I been lying here?" he demanded impatiently, as though he had not heard her speak. "It is 10 days since you were taken ill," she replied, in a low voice. 10 days, he repeated in a stupefied tone, as though unable to realize the import of the lapse of time. "It is incredible. It seems to me as though it was only a few hours. What has happened? What has been done by the police? Has the murderer been arrested?" It came to Miss Herodotus with a shock that his dormant brain had awakened to leap back to the thing which had paralyzed it, and with that knowledge came the realization that the dreaded moment for the revelation she had to make had arrived. And, like a woman, she sought to postpone it. "Phil," she said weakly, "do not talk about it until you are stronger." "I am strong enough not to be treated as a child," he rejoined fretfully, turning on her a sallow face, with a bright spot in each cheek. "Is the funeral over?" "Some days ago," she murmured, and there was a thankful feeling in her heart that it was so. Before he had time to speak again there was a tap at the door, and a maidservant entered. "Mr. Musard would like to speak to you for a moment, ma'am," she said to Miss Herodotus. Miss Herodotus caught eagerly at the respite. "Tell him I will come at once. Phil," she added, turning to her nephew, "I will send Vincent to you. He can tell you better than I. He has been here all through your illness, and has looked after everything." She hurried from the room without waiting for his reply. She saw the tall form of Musard standing in the hall, and went rapidly to him. "Phil has come to his senses, Vincent," she exclaimed, in an agitated voice. "He wants to know everything that has happened since he was taken ill. What shall we do?" "He must be told, of course," replied Musard, with masculine decision. "It is better that he should know than be kept in suspense. How is he?" "He seems quite normal and rational." "Will you see him and tell him?" "Yes. As a matter of fact, it is advisable that he should know everything without delay. I sent for you to tell you that Detective Caldew has just arrived to ascertain if Phil can identify the revolver. I told him Phil was still ill, but he is persistent, and thinks that he ought to be allowed to see him. It would be better if Phil could see him, and settle the point." "Oh, Vincent, do you think it is wise?" "Yes. Phil has had a shock, but it is not going to kill him, and the sooner he takes up his ordinary life again the better it will be for him. Come, now, everything will be all right." He smiled at her anxious face reassuringly. "Leave it to me. I will see that nothing is done to agitate Phil if I do not think him strong enough to bear it. Now, let us go to him." The bedroom door was open and Phil was standing near it as though awaiting their appearance. He held out his hand to Musard, who was surprised by the strength of his grip. He eyed the young man critically, and thought he looked fairly well considering the ordeal he had passed through. "I am glad to see you better, Phil," he said. "How do you feel? Not very fit yet?" "I am all right," responded Phil quickly. "Now, Musard, I want you to tell me all that has happened since I have been lying here. I am completely in the dark. Has anybody been arrested for the murder of my wife?" He spoke in a dry impersonal tone as though of some occurrence in which he had but a remote interest, but Musard was too keen a judge of men to be deceived by his apparent calmness. He thought that it was better for him to learn the truth at once. "Yes, Phil," he said quietly, "there has been an arrest. Hazel Rath has been arrested for the murder of Violet." "Who?" The tone of detachment disappeared. The interrogation was flung at Musard's head with a world of incredulity and amazement. "Hazel Rath, the housekeeper's daughter." "In the name of God, why?" "Gently, laddie. Sit down, and take it quietly. I'll tell you all." Phil controlled himself with a painful effort, and took a chair near the bedside. "Go on," he said hoarsely. Musard seated himself on the edge of the bed at his side, and entered upon a narration of the circumstances which had led to the arrest of Hazel Rath. Phil listened attentively, but the expression of amazement never left his face. When Musard finished he was silent for a moment, and then impetuously broke out. "I feel sure Hazel Rath did not commit this crime." Musard was silent. That was a question upon which he did not feel called upon to advance an opinion. Miss Herodotus was too moved to speak. "Why do you not say something?" exclaimed Phil, turning on her angrily. "Surely you do not think Hazel guilty?" "Oh, Phil," responded his aunt piteously, "it seems hard to believe, but what else can we think? There was the revolver and the handkerchief found in her mother's room, and the little greenstone brooch you gave her was picked up in Violet's bedroom. Why do they think she has killed her? Tell me that." Musard, in his narration of the facts, had omitted mention of the supposed motive, but he now made a gesture to Miss Herodotus to indicate that she had better tell Phil. "It was because the police believed that Hazel was in love with you, Phil," she falteringly said. They think she murdered Violet in a fit of jealousy. Hazel in love with me? He echoed the phrase in mingled scorn and amazement. That is preposterous. If the police have nothing better than that to go on. They have, interrupted Musard. They are going on the clues I have mentioned, the brooch, the handkerchief, and the revolver. Where did Hazel get the revolver? It is thought she got it from the gunroom. There are no revolvers in the gunroom, rejoined Phil quickly. We have no revolvers, unless Father bought one recently. What make is it? The ownership of the revolver is a point the police have not yet been able to settle, returned Musard. It is only an assumption on their part that Hazel got it from the gunroom. They thought it either belonged to the house or was left behind by one of the guests. Neither your aunt nor I knew, and Sir Philip was unable to settle the point. The police thought you might know. As a matter of fact, one of the detectives engaged in the investigations has just arrived from London and brought the revolver with him to see if you can identify it. I should like to see him. Where is he? In the library. I will bring him in. Musard left the room and quickly returned with Caldew, who entered with a businesslike air. This is Mr. Herodotus, said Musard. I trust you are better, Mr. Herodotus, said the detective smoothly. I am sorry to trouble you so soon after your illness, but there is a point we would like to settle before the trial of the woman who is charged with murdering your wife. We want, if possible, to establish the ownership of the weapon with which the murder was committed. He produced a revolver from the pocket of his light overcoat as he spoke. In view of the evidence, the identification of the weapon does not matter much one way or another, but it is as well to fix the point, if we can. The girl refuses to say where she obtained the revolver. Indeed, she remains stubbornly silent about the crime, and refuses to say anything about it. That doesn't matter very much either, because the evidence against her is so strong that she is bound to be convicted. Can you tell me anything about the revolver, Mr. Herodotus? Do you recognize it? Phil was turning the revolver over in his hands, examining it closely. Yes, he said. I recognize it. It belongs to Captain Nepcote. Captain Nepcote? Who is he? He is a friend of my nephew's who was staying here, but left the afternoon of the day the murder was committed, said Miss Herodotus. He was recalled to the front, I understand. I gave his name to Superintendent Marrington as one of the guests who had been staying here. How do you identify the revolver as his property? Asked Caldew, turning to Phil. By the bullet mark in the handle. The day before my wife was killed it was raining, and some of the guests were down in the gunroom shooting at a target with Nepcote's revolver. He showed us this mark in the handle, and said that it had saved his life in France. He was leading his men in a night raid on the German lines, and a German officer fired at him at close range, but the bullet glanced off the handle of the revolver. Then there can be no doubt Hazel Rath got it from the gunroom, said Caldew, returning the weapon to his pocket. Captain Nepcote must have left it behind him there, and that is where Hazel Rath found it. No. That seems impossible, said Phil. Well, I think it is quite possible, replied Caldew. Is it your opinion, then, that Miss Rath is guilty? Demanded Phil, with a note of sharp anger in his voice. Phil, said Miss Herodotus, you must not excite yourself. But the young man took no notice of his aunt's gentle remonstrance. His eyes were fixed on the detective. I have not the least doubt of it, was the detective's cold response. I must say I think you have made a terrible mistake, Phil said, striding about the room in a state of great agitation. Hazel she could not have done this thing. He wheeled sharply around, as though struck by a sudden thought. "Are the jewels safe?" he added. "Yes," said Miss Herodotus. "We found Violet's jewel case locked, so I put it away in the library safe." "The question of robbery does not enter into the crime," remarked Caldew. "The motive, as we have established it, is quite different." "I have been told of the motive you allege against this unhappy girl," said Phil indignantly. "That idea is utterly preposterous. Again, I say, I believe that you have made a blunder. I do not think Hazel would handle a revolver. She was always very nervous of firearms." "That is quite true," murmured Miss Herodotus. "A jealous woman forgets her fears," said the detective rather maliciously. "She didn't stop to think of that when she wanted to use the revolver." "And where did she get it from?" asked Phil quickly. Caldew shrugged his shoulders, but remained silent. "You still persist in thinking that she obtained the revolver from the gunroom?" Phil continued. "Yes, I do." "Do you not intend to make any further inquiries?" "You had better see Nepcote about the revolver. I will give you his address." "Captain Nepcote left here to go to the front, and we have not heard from him since," Miss Herodotus explained to the detective. In a calmer moment Caldew might have realized the expediency of Phil's suggestion, but his professional dignity was affronted at what he considered the young man's attempt to interfere in the case and direct the course of the police investigations. It was the desire to snub what he regarded as a meddlesome interposition in his own business which prompted him to reply. "It is a matter of small importance, one way or the other. It is sufficient for the Crown case to know the owner of the revolver. The point is that the murder was committed with it, and it was subsequently found in the girl's possession." "I have nothing more to say to you," said Phil. "Are you convinced now, Phil?" asked Miss Herodotus sadly, when Caldew had taken his departure. "It was hard for me to believe at first, but everything seems so certain." "I am not at all convinced," was the stern reply. "On the contrary, I feel sure that some terrible mistake has been made. I would stake my life on the innocence of Hazel Rath. How can you, who have known her so long, believe she would do a deed like this? The detective who has just left us is obviously a fool, and I am not satisfied that all the facts about Violet's death have been brought to light. I am going to London at once to bring another detective to inquire into the case. You know more about these things than me, Musard. Can you tell me of a good man?" "If you are determined to bring in another detective, you cannot do better than get Colwyn," replied Musard. "Colwyn, the famous private detective? He is the very man I should like. Where is he to be found?" "He has rooms somewhere near Ludgate Circus. I will write down the address. I think he will come, if he is not otherwise engaged." "Why should he refuse?" demanded Phil haughtily. "I will pay him well." "It is not a question of money with a man like Colwyn, and I advise you not to use that tone with him if you want his help." "Very well," said Phil, pocketing the address Musard had written down. "I will catch the 6:30 evening train up. Aunt, you might tell them to give me something to eat in the small breakfast room. I do not want to be bothered getting dinner in town." "Phil, dear, you mustn't dream of going to London in your present state of health," expostulated Miss Herodotus tearfully. "Why not leave it until you are stronger? Vincent, try and persuade him not to go." "Phil is the best judge of his own actions in a matter like this," replied Musard gravely. At least let Vincent go with you, Phil, urged his aunt. I want nobody to accompany me, replied Phil, speaking in a tone he had never used to his aunt before. I will go and get ready. Tell Linton to have the small car ready to drive me to the station.